Last year we saw the introduction of Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, which is the new name for stamp duty in Scotland. This year there is the additional dwelling supplement. Now, everybody thinks this relates to buy-to-let properties, but as we'll see in a moment, it extends to far more. So let's start off with a brief rundown of LBTT. It applies to both residential and commercial land and buildings. It includes leases, and it's administered by Revenue Scotland. Now, it's a progressive tax arranged in bands, so that you build up the amount of tax payable looking at the relevant bands and applying a certain percentage, and then adding them all together. There are rates for both residential and commercial properties, and you'll see the rates for residential properties up on the screen. Where there's mixed use, then the property is treated as commercial, but the big headache is going to be the additional dwelling supplement, and we'll come back to that in a moment. This slide shows the rates for commercial property, and you'll see that there's fewer bands and the percentages are generally lower. But there are a lot of complications, particularly with leases, which I'm not going to cover today. The area that I think will catch a lot of people out is the ADS. This is the additional dwelling supplement and applies from the 1st of April 2016. The current rate is 3%, and this is in addition to the LBTT on the property. Now, I think this is going to catch a lot of people out. Because it applies to additional residential properties. Now, the additional property is in Scotland, but it doesn't matter where the original property was. It can apply to buy-to-lets, but not all the time. It can catch second homes, but it's limited to properties costing more than £40,000. So let's now look at some questions and answers which are on the Revenue Scotland website, but give a useful insight into the operation of the tax. Now, in our first example, someone is buying their next house, which will be their main residence. They're selling an existing main residence, but the contract has been delayed. Now, ADS would ordinarily apply in this case, but a subsequent change to the legislation now means that if the sale of the previous main residence takes place before the tax return for the purchase of the main residence is made, no ADS is due. In our second example, somebody is proposing to sell their house to move to a bigger house, but having difficulty selling the original house and therefore renting it out. In this case, ADS is payable, and this is because when the purchase of the new house is settled, they will have two or main dwellings. So ADS will be due even though the new house is their new residence and not a buy-to-let. Now, in our next example, we have an enterprising young person who is proposing to buy a property and use it as a buy-to-let while staying at home with their parents. Now, you would expect, because of all the publicity, that ADS would be due because it's a buy-to-let, but this is not the case. The property is not an additional dwelling, it is their only dwelling, and so no ADS is payable. Now, I think our next example will be fairly typical and relates to a situation where somebody is relocating from England, cannot sell their previous residence, but has acquired a property in Scotland. They have acquired an additional property and therefore ADS is payable. However, if they can sell their former residence in England within 18 months, they will be able to claim a repayment of the ADS that they have had to pay up front. Our final example relates to somebody who has a property in Berlin but wants to relocate back to Scotland. Now, buying a property in Scotland will mean that they will own two dwellings, one in Scotland and one in Germany, and so the additional dwelling supplement will apply to the purchase of the new home in Scotland. So there was an assumption that the ADS was to deter people from buy-to-let properties, but in actual fact it's going to affect everybody who is buying and selling properties, and possibly in ways they don't imagine. I'm Alan Long from the Long Partnership, making life less taxing.